Okay, so I am pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Camille St. James, and I'm going to let her do a more in-depth introduction of herself. But Dr. St. James is a psychologist at Caron's Philadelphia office, and we're super excited to have her tonight. So thank you, Dr. St. James, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mallory. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. So Mallory, again, thank you for making the time to make this webinar happen and make this resource available to so many people. And thanks to all of you for showing up and for doing something for yourself, for your recovery, for your family, for your loved ones, and making this possible, because we can't do these webinars without you. So thank you for your time this evening as well. As Mallory said, I'm a psychologist at Caron. I started there as a postdoctoral fellow and worked up on our main campus in Wernersville in the inpatient setting for 4 years. And then somewhat recently transferred to our outpatient services here in Plymouth Meeting, which is just outside of Philadelphia. And I am delighted to be working with such a powerful team of people where we help to extend people's engagement with treatment, which is all part of Caron's commitment to helping people enjoy recovery for life. And so while working inpatient was really a passion for me for a while, it's delight to see the continuum of care and watch people really grow into their recovery. And I get to do that on a daily basis. So it's really an honor. And in addition to focusing on addiction, which is why I really entered this field, I also have a passion and interest in helping people who struggle with various types of trauma. And tonight we're going to be talking about ambiguous loss, which is a form of trauma for many people. And it's something that we don't talk a lot about. So I really jumped at the opportunity to bring this content to you all. And I do encourage you to please put questions in the chat or take notes, and we can address them at the Q&A at the end, whatever works for you all. But because we're going to be talking about trauma, I think it's really important to just establish this as a safe space for everybody, right? We are going to be covering a vignette that's very general in content, but we are going to be talking about loss. And so I encourage you all to take care of yourselves throughout this presentation. If you need to turn your camera off or step away or do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves, because self-care is a key component to all of our well-being, and practicing that is really important. So I encourage you all to do so this evening. And so I guess with that, we'll go ahead and get started. When I first started working on this topic of ambiguous loss, which was several years ago with some colleagues, I came across this quote, and it just, for me, really captured the complexity of this topic of ambiguous loss. This quote by Kafka: "You are at once both the quiet and the confusion of my heart." And so anyone here who has a loved one or who has themselves struggled with addiction, this probably has resonance for you. And so to help us sort of frame and give context to some of the ideas that we're going to be talking about tonight, I want to share with you a story of Sarah. So Sarah and Tom were high school sweethearts, and they married shortly after college, and soon thereafter had their first child, Sam. And Sarah and Tom went on to finish school, focus on their careers, and start their family. And while they were in high school and college, both Tom and Sarah were pretty much party animals. But after college, and as they started into their adult life, Tom's drinking sort of declined and normalized. He was the kind of guy who will have a beer while watching the game on Sunday or have a glass of wine with dinner. Sarah, on the other hand, her drinking seemed to continue at a similar pace to the way they used to drink in college. As Sarah's drinking progressed, it became more in volume and more frequently that she was under the influence, to the point where she was often not available to her family. As a result, her parents had to step in and help with childcare. And things seemed to sort of plateau for a while. And during that time, this is now several years later, she and Tom had 2 more children. But sadly, Sarah's drinking continued to progress. She stopped working in order to be a full-time mom. And because of her drinking and her inability to really function fully in her family, her parents really had to step in and help out more and more with childcare. And now Sam, their older child, their son, he was around 10 years old by this time. And so he saw his mom struggling and started to step in to try and help out around the house. He would sometimes do some cleaning. He would cook meals. He would try to help put his younger siblings to bed at night. Sarah's husband, Tom, becoming quite concerned about his wife and about the state of their family, took on more and more responsibility at work to make sure that they had the means they needed to take care of everybody. And so this pattern continued for a time. Some family members expressed concern to Sarah about her drinking, but she often would minimize it, say that she doesn't drink more than her friends, etc. But then after a DUI, she finally agreed to go to treatment. So Sarah went away to a 28-day treatment. And during that time, her parents and Sam took care of the younger siblings, while Tom worked long hours and attended the family programming at her treatment facility. After treatment, Sarah came home, attended IOP, and started engaging in 12-step meetings. She started getting into service in her home group and socializing with her new super friends. And initially, Tom and the kids were delighted that Sarah was doing so well, and her parents were really happy that their daughter was healthy. But soon, they started to become a little resentful because she was still, even though sober, was not really available to them. After about 3 months, Sarah relapsed. At this point, Tom was really worn out, and he asked her to please go to sober living. So Sarah did. She went into a PHP and then an IOP, and during that time was in sober living. But Tom still wasn't ready for her to come home, and so she moved back in with her parents for 6 months. She eventually moved back home and has been home for 2 years, and she's been sober now for quite a while. There were a few relapses in there, but she's been solidly sober for well over a year, and her family is doing really well. She's back to work part-time. Her older son, Sam, is now in college, and the 2 younger kids are doing well in school and being taken care of jointly by both their parents. And the grandparents get to be grandparents again. So I recognize this is a bit of a fairy tale of a recovery story, but it highlights certain key components that are going to be helpful and illustrate some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about tonight. So what is ambiguous loss? Ambiguous loss is a loss that occurs without clarity of reaching emotional closure or a clear understanding. Now, anybody who is in or around people who are recovering from addiction can probably relate to this, right? Certainly in active addiction, for all involved, there is this sense of a lack of clarity. There is a sense of, when is this going to end? We have no idea when there's going to be closure for this. And it just seems very confusing. And there's so much about addiction that is hard to understand from the outside. Ambiguous loss is also the result of an extraordinary stressor that feels unending. And if that's not a definition of active addiction, I don't know what is, right? It is an extraordinary stressor that certainly for all involved feels like it's unending. Is this person going to stay sober? Even once they're in recovery, how long is the recovery going to last? Are they going to relapse? All these questions just feel unending, and the stress just perpetuates. One important element of ambiguous loss is the fact that it's a relational condition. It's this sense of relationship between either an individual, two individuals, or an individual in themselves. But it's always has this relational component to it or content to it. There are a lot of different things that can lead to this sense of ambiguous loss. Things like divorce, right? Both adults involved in divorce can experience ambiguous loss because this person who is a part of their life is no longer there. And they're still maybe partially there because there might be children involved. And so there's this ambiguity about all that. Adoption can produce feelings of ambiguous loss, illness, estrangement, incarceration, certainly addiction, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Separation due to immigration, unexplained disappearances, and that can also be a factor in addiction when loved ones just seem to disappear for periods on end. War, acts of terrorism, deportation, genocide, and natural disasters, all these things can result in this feeling of uncertainty, confusion, and a lack of closure that are associated with ambiguous loss. But there are two key conditions that tend to be present when we experience ambiguous loss. And those two conditions are these. The first one, physical absence and psychological presence. This occurs when somebody is physically away. They're no longer in our circles. They're not present in our lives, but psychologically, they're taking up a lot of space. An example of this might be when someone is missing due to active addiction, or when someone's missing due to being in treatment, right? We know that they're alive and they're there, but they're not physically with us. But again, they're taking up a lot of emotional and psychological space in our lives. So that's physical absence and psychological presence. The flip side to that same coin is physical presence and psychological absence. So this is when somebody is there, they're physically there, but emotionally and psychologically, they're absent from us. And so this again could be somebody when they're in active addiction, right? They might be physically in our lives, but emotionally and psychologically just not able to be there for us or with us. Could also be somebody who is sober and focuses solely on their recovery. So they're back and they're doing well, they're sober, right? Very happy for that, physically around, but again, maybe not having the bandwidth to be as psychologically or emotionally present in our lives as we would like. So again, they are physically there, but unable to be psychologically present. And these two conditions tend to be indicative of many aspects of ambiguous loss. So let's go back to Sarah's story. How does this apply to her and her family? So if you think about it, when she was in her active use, there were times where she wasn't able to be there for her family, so much so that her 10-year-old son had to do the cooking. And so she was physically present, but psychologically absent. Similarly, when she went away to treatment, she was physically absent, but psychologically very present for the family. And also when she was in recovery and spending a lot of time with her friends, going to meetings, maybe getting into service, maybe going to conferences, etc. She was, again, physically present back in their lives, but psychologically not very available. And all of these conditions can leave a person feeling this sense of loss, like there's something that I have lost in this relationship or lost in this connection. Other qualities of ambiguous loss, particularly as it pertains to addiction and substance abuse, is this sense of uncertainty. And I mentioned that earlier, where certainly most people whose lives are touched by addiction can probably relate to this. That There is so much uncertainty, certainly when somebody is in active addiction, right? Are they safe? Are they well? Are they sober? Have they relapsed? Are they making good choices? All those things. And that can leave this sense of loss because of that, all that uncertainty. Role ambiguity, and this is something we're going to talk quite a bit about, so I'm just going to touch on it for a second here. Role ambiguity is really the loss associated with a loss of identity due to substance abuse. And this is true for family members, for the individual who might be addicted, etc. And we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on that because I think this is one of those areas of ambiguous loss that is not as well acknowledged and understood and deserves a little bit of time. Another key factor that comes up with ambiguous loss is the fact of shame and stigma. Ambiguous loss due to alienation and isolation within the family system and with other supports. So what I mean by that is, think about it that we have a hard time talking about addiction in general, right? And especially outside of groups or webinars such as this. And when there is a family member who's struggling with addiction, that's a hard thing to navigate in terms of maybe even within the family system itself. Does everybody know? Are we allowed to tell everybody? What stories, how much, et cetera, et cetera. And so that can start to make a person or an individual or a part of the family feel very isolated, right? Similarly, outside of the family system, you know, when we talk about addiction, that's already carries so much stigma still, sadly, in our society, that other people might start to distance themselves and might not want to talk about it and might have a hard time understanding. And so that alienation can create isolation for people, which disengages potential available support systems. We all, as social creatures, need those safe spaces to be able to lean on people, to talk about what's going on in our lives. And addiction can be a very big thing going on in our lives. And it's hard when there's nowhere to go with that, where there's little understanding or reciprocity that comes, or just general acknowledgement and support. And so shame and stigma can contribute to this sense of deep loss for individuals and family members who are touched by substance abuse. Other ways that ambiguous loss can impact families. Some may not see the situation as a loss at all, right? If we look at Sarah and Tom's story, there are those in Tom's family who might just be really grateful that Sarah's getting treatment and how nice that you have this time to yourself, right? Versus acknowledging that Tom has had to make all these adjustments in his life and with his family in order to keep things moving, and that he's really missing his wife. And the absence of that acknowledgement can amplify the sense of loss. The absence of a ritual marking the loss may signal that it's not a loss at all. In many cultures, we've developed robust, sometimes elaborate ways to mark when we lose a loved one. But when the loss is ambiguous, there's no such demarcation, there's no such recognition, there's no ritual around these kinds of losses. And so that can leave a person feeling like, well, it's not a real loss then, because it doesn't carry that same kind of weight. The lack of finality, and again, the lack of recognition can communicate that this isn't a real loss, right? And when we feel like something's not a real loss, we may have those internal narratives of, oh, I need to just get over this. Oh, why is this weighing on me so much? And that negative self-talk that can get kicked up. And when we have the stigma that I mentioned earlier, and that lack of connection to social supports, we lose those opportunities and those natural resources that we might lean on to help us cope through difficult times. And if many of the messages that we're getting is that this isn't a real loss, we're not even on a conscious or subconscious level allowing ourselves to start to work through the grieving process that would be really appropriate in these times. Unrecognized loss, again, can result in less support, and the lack of that support can make us feel less connected and like we're just not understood. And I've worked with some people who have loved ones in various stages of recovery, and they just feel like nobody understands me. And that lack of understanding can lead people to feel like, am I crazy? Am I making this up? Right? And then these extended periods of uncertainty create stress. As some of you who are on this webinar tonight might know from your own personal experiences, when you have a loved one who is in active addiction or in and out of recovery, that creates an inordinate amount of stress on an individual, on a family system. And as a result of that, boundaries and roles become really unclear. People having to step in and step up in ways that they weren't expecting. And that too can create a lot of stress. So since I mentioned earlier, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on role ambiguity. And it does tie into what I was just saying too, that so much stress is created and sometimes people have to step in and step up to help out. And it just adds to the confusion. So role confusion as it relates to substance use can show up in a lot of different ways. Enmeshment is often a big piece of it as well. And so here are just a few examples, and I know there are many more. Children can end up in caretaking roles to their parents who are struggling with addiction or to other siblings. But children can also be affected if a sibling is, say, the quote unquote identified patient who is struggling with addiction and maybe other mental health issues. The quote unquote healthy child can take on that role, and that can be very confusing for them because maybe they don't feel like the healthy child, or that they feel like they have to be the perfect child or the one who's not a problem. Grandparents, their roles can get changed. They can end up as primary caregivers to grandkids, or they can end up being parents once again to adult children. I have some personal experience with this in that my favorite aunt, her daughter, my cousin, who struggles with substance use, had a baby and recognized pretty quickly that she was not in any kind of condition to take care of this child. And my aunt, being the amazing person that she is, of course, stepped in and took this beautiful baby boy under her wing. But I remember having conversations with her about her frustration and her shame for some of the things she was feeling, because this all happened right at the time when she and my uncle had just started planning their retirement. And they had plans for what this phase of their life was going to be like. And because of this unexpected change, all those plans had to go by the wayside. And my aunt was really feeling alone because she didn't know who else she could talk to about these very confusing feelings she was having. Because of course she loved her grandson and would do anything for him, and in fact did. And he's now doing really well and going to just started college this year. But it really took her a long time to find the right resources and supports where she could feel connected and acknowledge the loss of her retirement. Adult children, when they're in active addiction, can end up being dependents, and that can be a total role flip for them. And children with addiction can end up engaging in very adult behaviors, and that can lead to role confusion for them as well. It's also really important to factor in the developmental aspects of all of this, right? So if you have a younger child who ends up in a caretaking role, that's not where they are supposed to be in terms of their natural arc of development. And so it disrupts their development as a child, and in a way they end up losing parts of their childhood. But similarly, like in my aunt's case, a grandparent has their natural arc of development interrupted as well if they end up taking on the responsibilities for caregiving either grandchildren or having their own children move back in. And having these types of arrests happen in our development is, again, a huge sense of loss. I've lost that part of my life that was meant, quote unquote, meant to happen. And then it doesn't happen because of the role of addiction in the family. And so let's look at how this might apply to Sarah. So again, we have Sam here preparing some meals. And when he's doing that, what role is he in? Who is he being in that moment? Is he just a kid? Is he a child? Or is he really taking on a parenting role? Is he a sibling to his siblings, or is he a parent to his siblings? Or is he a caregiver to his mom? Who is he? And it's one thing for us to sit here. I imagine most of us on this webinar tonight are adults, right? To come with our full complement of our prefrontal cortex already wired, right? But at 10 years old, a child doesn't have all that, and it's that much harder for them to make sense of things. And so what does he lose in the process? He loses parts of his childhood. He might lose parts of his identity. He might lose parts of his coping skills as a child in terms of playfulness and lightheartedness that comes with a typical healthy childhood. And we look at the grandparents' side of things. If they're doing childcare, the question comes up, who are they? Are they the parents, or are they the grandparents? Are they the parents to young children or to their older adult children? And what do they lose in the process? Do they lose the dream of just being the grandparents and being able to take the kids on and then send them home, right? Get them all sugared up and send them home, right? Do they lose the dream of their dream retirement or what their life was going to be like? Or maybe they just wanted to have time for the two of them to really bond and reconnect. So there's all kinds of losses that can happen as a result of this role ambiguity that happens with ambiguous loss. I think it's really important for us to think about not just the role ambiguity, but the identity confusion that comes and how these things start to intersect. One of the things that I'm passionate about, in addition to addiction, treatment, and trauma, is work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that we talk a lot about there is this principle of intersectionality. And intersectionality is this idea that we are made up of a multitude of things, right? There are a lot of different things that make up my identity. I am a woman, I am a psychologist, I am a sister, I am a wife, I am a friend, I'm all these things, right? But also my socioeconomic status, my race, my religious affiliation or lack thereof, my presence as a parent or not being a parent, all those things. All that complexity blends together to make up who I am. And when aspects of that identity get distorted or altered or disrupted or interrupted as a result of ambiguous loss, it can create a lot of identity confusion. But because, as we know, addiction is a family disease and we are social creatures, it's not just what's going on in my individual intersectional identity, it's how that then intersects with everybody else's complex identity. And so I might be feeling a significant amount of loss in one aspect and less so in another. And again, I go back to the example of my aunt, right? So she was delighted to be able to take care of her grandson and be there for him. But she was very confused about the loss of her role as a grandmother, right? And when we think about, say, in the case of Sarah, her husband, Tom, his identity as a provider and a professional, and how was that intersecting with his identity as a parent? He was losing his role as a parent because of the responsibilities he was taking on to be the provider, right? Because of the active addiction in that family. And so these things get complicated and hard to talk about and kind of easy to skim over or brush under the rug. But these are the kinds of tender places that, if left unaddressed, can perpetuate cycles of hurt and disruption, both within an individual, but also within the family system. I think too, for individuals who are in recovery from addiction, and we were just talking about this in our recovery maintenance group here last night, the idea of identifying as an individual with an addiction, right? And this goes back to that conversation about stigma and the isolation that can come with the stigma, right? So if I'm an individual who's in recovery, am I comfortable saying that I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic? And how does that identity then either lend itself to creating space for more connection and help to heal some of that sense of loss? And where does that identity maybe create more distancing and create a greater sense of loss? And so there's so much ambiguity with that, and having to navigate that and figure that out is a complex thing. As it relates to family members, it becomes even more complicated. As I mentioned a little earlier, right? How does a family member talk about their loved one who's struggling with addiction? What's okay to talk about? What's not okay to talk about? There's 12-step programs that have the word anonymous in their name. And so that often causes people to feel like they can't talk about any of it. It all has to be anonymous. And if everything's anonymous, then nobody knows anything and nobody's talking about anything and nobody's getting the support that they need and deserve. And so, again, because I'm in recovery, am I a healthy person? Or am I a person with an addiction? And even within the field of psychology, we are constantly evolving the language that we use. And we are trying to use more person-first language, right? So a person with addiction versus an addict or an alcoholic, right? Because people are complex. They are more than just their addiction. But also wanting to respect if somebody is in a 12-step program that does encourage people to identify a certain way, how do we make room for that? And how do we not let that compound this sense of disconnection? Professionally, this is, again, something else that came up in our recovery maintenance group last night is, how much do we disclose about things? What if a loved one, like in Sarah's case, had to step out of work, right? What if she had been working before she went to rehab? How do we talk about that with her employer? And there's HIPAA laws and there's HR departments and there's all these things. and family members end up walking on eggshells. And so again, there's this sense of loss and ambiguity that comes with all of that. And it's hard to navigate. It's hard to know what's the right thing to do. And so what do we do? How do we help to mend some of this as it specifically relates to the role confusion or the role ambiguity? And the first thing is just to start by trying to redefine what healthy roles are. And we do that first and foremost by setting healthy boundaries. And we had a workshop here a couple of weeks ago that focused on this topic, right? Setting healthy boundaries within families with substance use and addiction. And it's not easy. That's why we have workshops to help people with it, because there's one thing about articulating a boundary, and there's another thing altogether about setting a boundary and holding it. And so I encourage everybody here, if this is something that, if you're relating to any of this material, one good place to start is with some content around setting boundaries. And maybe Mallory can provide the titles of some of the books that we've recommended to people in the chat. But setting boundaries becomes a superpower as it relates to healing some of the role ambiguity associated with this. And then certainly doing some of your own individual work, finding ways to do self-care, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, just taking care of yourselves, figuring out, what does self-care feel like? What is it that I need? Who are my allies that I can really be honest with and rely on? And I'm not just saying this because I'm a psychologist, but because I believe in the inherent benefits of doing therapy for everybody. And certainly if you're somebody whose life is being touched by addiction, you deserve the support. So I strongly encourage people to do their own work by having the support of a trained therapist. And in addition to that, there's also building community. We're social creatures and we need one another. We need the support of other people. And so there's thankfully a lot of beautiful resources out there, including Al-Anon, including all the Caron family groups. Again, thank you, Mallory. And other resources if you need it. And Caron is a great place to start, and we can help you expand what that network of support looks like. But what do we do more broadly? What do we do for individuals, for ourselves as individuals, but also for our family systems in terms of starting to heal this loss? And the first thing, I'm going to walk through all 6 of these boxes. So the first thing is open communication. Let's start by reducing some of the stigma. Let's start by acknowledging the sense of loss that we might be experiencing because our loved one is struggling with addiction, or because we ourselves are struggling with addiction and our families feel so distant from us, whatever the case may be. Right? By having more open communication, it opens up access to supports. If people don't know that we're struggling, they don't know that help might be needed. And so by talking about it, we open up access to supports. It also, once we get better at communicating and talking about what's going on with ourselves, it allows for a greater clarification of what are the needs really, right? And then people can show up and help. So open communication is the first step. Manageability. We talk about manageability in treatment all the time, helping people who struggle with addiction to make their lives more manageable. And so thinking about, what are the things that you can control? What are the things that your family can control? And this is where setting and holding clear boundaries is really important. And again, I can't reiterate it enough that there's one thing about stating a boundary, there's another thing entirely about setting and holding a boundary. And this requires work around, what are my values and understanding what limits I'm willing to hold and what am I just not ready to yet. And also managing expectations. And again, this is something that we talk about both within the treatment world, but also in support of families and helping people to set manageable expectations. What is it that I can actually expect this person to do or not do? If somebody's been behaving a certain way for a really long time and is doing nothing to change that behavior, there's no reason to expect them to behave any differently. And so managing those expectations. Focus on roles. I know I spoke quite a bit about the role ambiguity because, again, I think this is one of those sort of underlying corrosive things that left unaddressed can really be problematic and doesn't get enough attention. But important to clarify roles. What's my role in this situation? Once I know and define that role, it's easier. It's like putting the bumpers up on a bowling alley. Now I know exactly the lane I'm supposed to be in, and it's easier for me to keep walking the path, right? So I have a real clearly defined role. Helps me identify needs of the individual, my own needs, also the needs within the family system. If I have a sense like this is my child, right? Their role in this family system is that of a child. That clarity helps me understand what they need and what my expectations of them should be. Network of support. Again, Al-Anon. I can't say enough about Al-Anon. It's an amazing organization that has saved countless families. Caron family groups, again, shout out Mallory. But Caron, it's one of the reasons why I sought out Caron as a place to do the final stages of my training and why I love being here so much is because of our recognition that addiction is a disease is a family disease. And that if you don't treat the whole family, you're doing a disservice to both the family and the person who's struggling with addiction. And so we pour a lot of energy and thought and commitment into supporting families here at Caron. So glad to see you all taking advantage of that. And again, therapy, right? Developing your own support includes therapy. Creating rituals. Earlier, I mentioned that one of the things that can signal a loss as an ambiguous loss is this lack of rituals. So create ritual around honoring the losses that you're experiencing by doing self-care, through journaling, through finding other people and having shared experiences, but also creating shared experiences, right? Create some of that, take that uncertainty away or that unending stream that ambiguous loss can feel like, and create demarcations. Set meals, have set meals. I know somebody who had been struggling with relapse, their family decided rather than to have an intervention, the person knew they were going to go to treatment. They sat down and had a family meal together. And they said, when you're back, we're going to do this again to demarcate when you're back. Right. And so they created this ritual of having a celebratory meal together to help everybody involved with dealing with the ambiguity of this person's recovery journey. Creating art, sending cards, and then saving them and then having them as indicators of progress and shared experiences. So creating ritual can be really powerful. And that's also somewhat linked to this last one, leaning on cultural strengths. For many of us, we might have spiritual practices that can create community for us, that can create a sense of ease and connectedness, can create a place where we can have shared narratives and shared stories. Also, a sense of history and longevity, which can make what we're currently going through, which seems unending, and put it in a slightly different context. And that in and of itself can make it feel more manageable. So leaning on your cultural strengths, whatever they may be for you and your family. So I'll end where I started with this beautiful quote by Kafka. You are at once both the quiet and the confusion of my heart. And so hopefully after this brief introduction to this very complex topic, I hope that your hearts are a little bit more quiet, or at least have a sense of hope. I really appreciate your time. I've also included some of the resources that I pulled this information from. If you're a nerd like me and like reading these things, there they are. And I believe, yep,